Resuming debate. The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise today to address the amendments that we brought forward on the Canada-wide early learning and child care system. I addressed this going door to door in Calgary Centre many times, and it was when you speak to people that are trying to access daycare in Canada, you get an illustration of exactly the myriad of problems that we encounter as a society in making sure that we have this service available for Canadians. And it is important that we make sure we have this service available for Canadians. But I remember meeting somebody who had one child who was 3, and she was pregnant with her second child, and she was looking at what are the options here, and she looked at effectively where the various political parties were assessing what the solution would be. And she also had friends that had daycare operations in the neighborhood, and they had a different input than she was getting from various political parties. So depending where you are and the input you get on this subject, you have various degrees of understanding, you have various degrees of how you're going to access this system, how you're going to pay for this system, and effectively how it's going to work. But one of the things about this bill that I actually was quite curious about was when the Minister introduced it in December of 2022, just passed, and her quote for introducing this bill, which struck me a little odd, was, "The government must protect what we have built and make it harder for any future federal government to cancel or cut childcare and undo all that we have achieved for children and families." Now that's an interesting quote because we live in a democracy, and every one of these policies we put forward in Parliament, and we hope to sustain, has to prove to be effective at the end of the day. And getting towards more effective policies, we try and get better with each iteration. To be stuck on something that might be difficult to amend and move forward and progress in our society is not where we want to be. And I was a little surprised at the Minister's comments on that. Going back to the woman I met who was accessing it, she also said, we need to make sure that we adapt, and we continue to adapt as a society to the needs of our childcare, the people requiring childcare. I also looked at the whole issue about women participation in society, and this is the nub to me because I belong to a generation of Canadians where women traditionally took those, if you will call it 7 years off, sometimes it was 9 years as it was with my wife, to raise a family before she went back into the workforce. And this held her back in her career vis-a-vis the people that are in those primary years of their life and advancing their careers. And you think about the choices they have to make because of the childcare choices they have. And effectively, you see more executives in senior levels that are males because of that limitation of those years of experience you get that women choose to take that time off because of the limited options that they have for childcare. So an effective childcare system is going to advance a lot of social progress in making sure we have balance of men and women at senior levels in our both private sector and public sector organizations going forward. And I think it's a laudable goal. I think we need to achieve it. But one of the things I've always noticed about this government's bills is they're long on narrative. And this one again, you can put a big stamp in the window that says free $10 daycare, and yet you've got to, at the end of the day, execute against that plan. And that means boots in the ground. That means understanding where the bottlenecks are, where the hurdles are that you've got to get over in order to get that done. And one of the big bottlenecks in the childcare system, of course, is the access to labor. And that continues to be one of the main problems that we have as far as accessing daycare in Canada. Where's the labor going to come from? And right now that labor does not exist. CUPE actually came up with a stat, the Canadian Union of Public Employees, and they said that there is one space for every 3 children that need it, and that's not because of physical space, the rooms, the buildings, that's because of the access to the workers. Now the workers are the bottleneck here. We've got to make sure we've got enough workers in place and a sustainable system that allows those workers to actually deliver the services that society requires of them at an optimal level. Those aren't there because, frankly, the financial incentives aren't there to make that system work better and draw more people, more entrepreneurs into a system that provides a great service for Canadians that's going to achieve these laudable goals I spoke about earlier in my speech. That access to childcare for everybody, that access for women to re-enter the workforce and participate fully in executive ranks as they progress their careers, as their husbands have done for the last generation. This needs to be fixed. So making sure that bottleneck of the labor shortage gets addressed is key in addressing this. And that's what I talk about when I say execution is different than narrative. Accessibility, of course, is number one. I've met many people through my career that were not as advantaged financially as many people in society. And I recall the accessibility for daycare. They would actually take public transit from one end of the city to the other in order to drop off their kids. And then they'd take that public transit back downtown. This is Calgary, so you've got a good public transit system. But that, in effect, is an hour at the beginning of their day and an hour at the end of their day in order for them to get their kids somewhere safe and then get them at the end of the day to take them home. That is a big chunk of time out of your day, but that's because of what I've learned in this process is called daycare deserts. So there's no accessibility in certain areas where these people actually need this service, whether it's close to their work or close to their home. They've got to go a long way out of their way in order to get the service that's required of them, that they require. At the same time, they've also got, we have to revisit this because think about who's most affected by this. And who's most affected by this isn't people of means. It's people without means. So those people that are looking for those spaces are going to be the more marginalized sectors of society, the more marginalized economic sectors. The ability to access this, of course, if you are of means, is going to be better than if you aren't of means. We continue to have these deserts of daycare. We continue to have this accessibility problem all the way through. I had a friend, a very good friend of mine, and his sister was in the same boat. She was a daycare provider, and she took that public transit from South Edmonton to North Edmonton every day in order to deliver the service, again, because of a daycare desert. There was no daycare available at the very south end of Edmonton where she lived, and her skills, she's one of the daycare providers, was only supportable up in the north part of Edmonton at that point in time. And that, again, is a 1 hour commute. When you 1 hour commute, half an hour at each end of the day, that's a long time to add on to what you're going to what you're putting in every day. There's an issue there about inclusivity. So we've got to make sure that this inclusivity isn't just for public and nonprofit sector, but includes those people that are putting together those daycare spaces in our communities, getting rid of those so-called daycare deserts so that we can actually have those publicly funded or, as we say, $10 a day daycare available where they're needed in the communities where they're needed, set up by the entrepreneurs that are actually willing to train the people, get the funding, get the system up and running so that they can serve the clientele that live close to where they want to provide the services. This is all types of childcare we're talking about here. And this is backed up, of course, through the testimony committee here by the Association of Daycare Operators of Ontario. Now, I think most Canadians that are trying to access this daycare, which is a benefit, this is going to be a low cost. We want to make sure we get this into people's hands, but it's not going to be available. This is an accessibility problem that has to be addressed first and foremost in this bill. Get the boots on the ground, make sure we've got the ability to get people into positions before we start pretending we're delivering a service or saying we're delivering a service and not being able to execute. Having something in the store window and being able to deliver it to people are two entirely different things. And that's the issue here. We've got to make sure that we've got a system that works for the people we intend to serve via that new system. I'll go on in the Q&A because I know my time's running up here, Madam Speaker, but thank you very much tonight.
Questions and comments? The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Families, Children and Social Development.
Thank you, Madam Speaker, and I'd like to thank my colleague from Alberta. He and I have many great conversations here in the House, and I was thrilled to hear that he understands that how childcare is really a great contributor to social growth and advancement of women. It's certainly something I value. And when he talks about spaces, even in his own province of Alberta, 1,800 new childcare spaces were created under the program through the nonprofit system. But he also leaned into the issue of private care, and that's why the province of Alberta, determining where they had desert spaces, committed to another 5,500 going forward. So there is a system that needs to be built, so the system is being built, and I'd like to know if my honourable colleague will support C35 rather than debating on the title of the bill itself.
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
I thank my honourable colleague for the question. There is a lot that was packed in there, and I do think we addressed that a little bit. We talked about my province of Alberta. It is a growing province. Think about 1,800 daycare spaces in a province that's had a migration and an influx of 50,000 people over the last year. So you're still talking about a need that is largely unmet. 61% of Alberta daycare provided. It's got referred to it in my speech as a daycare desert. 61% of the access to daycare in Alberta is a daycare desert. Right. At the end of the day. So we've got problems, hurdles to overcome here in order to deliver that to people. And that is one of the reasons we want to make sure that this bill we're talking about today addresses the concerns about how it's going to meet the needs of Canadians. Thank you very much.
Questions and comments? The honourable member for Vancouver East.
Thank you very much, Madam Speaker, and I thank the member for his comments. I think for me in Vancouver East, the issue centers around three things with access to daycare. One, it is about affordability. So $10 a day daycare will make a difference for families. But the other issue, of course, is about the spaces. Access to the spaces and the creation of the spaces, which is also critical because there's a huge long wait list of people trying to get in to access daycare for their children. The last but not least is the point that the member also raised, and that is the issue around attraction and retention of childcare workers. And the key thing to do that, of course, does center around wages and working conditions. Now, this bill, I know my colleague, the member from Winnipeg Centre, worked really hard to trying to get amendments in there to address this critical issue. So my question to the member is this: would he agree, in order to ensure that we attract and retain quality childcare workers, that we actually ensure that there's fair wages, livable wages, as well as good working conditions for them?
The honourable member for Calgary Centre.
Well, that's an excellent question. And indeed, my colleagues in the committee informed me they put forward these amendments to make sure that there were these caveats built into the system so that there was the adjustments for labor that we talked about. Think about it from a supply and demand perspective, colleagues, Madam Speaker, through you, is that if there isn't the incentive to actually get into this business, i.e. the provision of a service that actually is going to make sense for people, you're not going to have people entering into that as a career or as a setup of a daycare. So that's why we're trying to expand this access to make sure it's available to all people and to make sure that impetus is there, that motivation to be able to provide the labor, people to make the choice about what labor they're going to have there and actually see themselves fulfilling this career for the rest of their lives. That is something that has to be part of this, because otherwise we're just tilting at paper on, words on paper here one more time. Let's get something that's executable.
For a brief question, the honourable member for Spadina, Fort York.
Speaker, I thank my colleague for his remarks. I appreciated his economic and financial and, frankly, the social analysis. Both him and I represent urban ridings, and one of the things that I think we both face are...
I just want to stop there for a second. I don't know, there seems to be a little bit of a sound coming through. I'm not sure if it's the honourable, if there's something near if the honourable member has something on the screen or a phone. Maybe we could retry. Okay.
Thank you, Madam Speaker. I thank my colleague for his remarks. I appreciated his economic and social analysis. Both him and I represent urban ridings, and like him, I've heard challenges around the labor shortage. There's no point in affordable, high-quality childcare if there are no spots available. And I'd appreciate if you could expand on kind of the labor workforce strategy or perhaps the lack thereof.
Yeah, that sound is still there whenever we open those mics, so maybe we'll have somebody check that out because it would be problematic for the interpreters. And I do want to remind the honourable member that he's to address all questions and comments through the chair and not directly to the member. The honourable member Calgary Centre, a brief answer, please.
Madam Chair, I thank my colleague for that question. I've always been impressed with his economic analysis of these matters, and he and I share our view on this about how you actually motivate society, motivate people in society to get into where the gaps are. There's got to be an incentive. We talked about this both from a labor perspective and from a spaces perspective. In those daycare deserts, you've got to make sure that there's a motivation to provide those. And that's why it's not just the not-for-profit and public that's going to work here. It's going to have to be available for all the people that want to provide these spaces in those established daycare deserts. There's a reason that those are served by other people right now, and they're jammed. So let's get those impetuses out of the way. Let's get those hurdles cleared. Let's get those bottlenecks broken. Let's get on with it. Thank you, Madam Speaker.
Debate.